Hello, good evening, and welcome. That's what they always used to say on the news. Hello, good evening, and welcome. My mother always used to say, it's a tautology. So I learnt the meaning of the word tautology very young. A tautology is when you say the same thing in two ways immediately, or you write the same thing in two different ways immediately, one after the other. So you basically repeat yourself like, hello, good evening. And welcome, of course, is a sort of opener as well. So yes, you've learnt something new, possibly. Or then again, possibly not. I feel like we've had a change of season since I last read to you. My goodness me. Saturday evening we sat one side of the fence and our neighbours sat the other side of the fence. And we had a glass of gin and tonic with them, and it was very civilised and really very nice. Well, the children ran around the garden and it was lovely. And now it's bitterly blooming cold. But there we are. It is actually sunny out there, but our house is quite old, and old houses are quite often quite drafty, and the result of that is that the wind sort of comes whistling through around the windows. Even in the new extension, the wind seems to come whistling through. I don't quite know how. Anyway, never mind. So we are on to chapter 5 of the Falconer's Quarry. So we're on book 3, chapter 5. I was thinking about this, so I've done 36 chapters so far, so I've been doing this for a while, and I'm going to be doing it for a while longer, because I'll certainly finish this book. So we'll have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 this week, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 next week, 15, 16, 17. So we've got 2.5 weeks more of this book before we come to the next one. And then we'll see where we all are and how we all feel and whether we carry on. But I imagine we probably will. Okay. So where have we got to? Chapter 4. Oh, yes. So Joe's just been in with Lucy to see Lucy's sister Anne, who is very ill. And she's got this bright red rash on her face and her neck, sort of around here. And her mum sent Lucy off for ripe cheese and dried fruit, and she said something about not being able to get lettuce and cucumber, I think, something like that. Yeah, and the things that they've done already, but it hasn't. Yeah, there's no cucumber or lettuce to be had to cool her fever, and she says the peony seed powder didn't seem to do anything at all, and I don't think the wormwood and house leek plaster has helped either. We need something more powerful. The physician will be able to calculate the stars for us. I mean, it's a very different approach to medicine, and it's not one that's really based on fact or research of any kind. It's based on a series of beliefs about the humours, the 4 humours. It's actually quite interesting, to do with fevers and bile, and oh gosh, when I wrote this book, I knew exactly what it was they believed, but it was so bizarre, I'm afraid I have not quite remembered. In any case, yeah, they're thinking about bloodletting, which is something that was very commonly done in the past, which is basically where you cut somebody and let some blood out to try and sort of wash out the illness. And of course the trouble is that very often that kills the person. If not from blood loss, then it can kill them from infection. Really quite grim. Okay, and then Lucy says to Joe, as they're just going down the stairs, you know what? There is one thing we could do. Chapter 5. We can help her get better? Joe asked, surprised. No, Lucy sounded wistful. Although we could pick some more primroses to fend off the sickness. No, I was thinking of your St. Christopher. What about it? It's what I was saying to you earlier. If we show it to Anne, at least she won't die unshriven. What's unshriven? It's when you die without confessing your sins to a priest. Then you have to go to purgatory before you can go to heaven, and you suffer terribly. But if we show your St. Christopher to Anne, she'll go straight to heaven if she dies today. She's not going to die today, Lucy. You don't know that. Maybe it's different where you come from, but in my world, children die all the time. We're one of the lucky families. My parents have only lost one child." "I know," Joe said. "What do you mean, you know?" Joe shepherded her down the stairs. If they were going to have this conversation, he wanted to do it face to face. As they emerged into the courtyard, a boy of about Joe's age hurried away. Had he been listening at the bottom of the stairs, Joe wondered. He skimmed quickly through what he and Lucy had been saying. There was nothing worth eavesdropping on as far as he could tell. In the courtyard, servants were still trotting back and forth. "Is there anywhere we can talk, away from people?" Joe asked. "We can't go far," Lucy said. "They'll be ringing the bell for dinner soon. Anyway, we have to go and find Mary, to get the fruit and cheese for Anne." "Where will she be?" "Attending to our clothes, I expect." "In the laundry?" "No, here in the castle. There's a room where all our gowns and cloaks are kept. This way." She went across the cobbles to another door. The room inside was the same size and shape as Lucy's room, but barely furnished at all. "What is that horrendous smell?" Joe asked, trying not to breathe in. "It's from the Jakes." She pointed to a doorway in the corner. "Jakes? Do you mean Lou's?" She looked blank. "You know, latrines," he added. "The necessary house," she said primly, "where you go to do your business. The castle has Jakes for most chambers." She sounded proud, though upstairs we use chamber pots at night and have them emptied in the morning. "Why use chamber pots if you have, Jakes? Surely it's better if everything goes down a chute." "It smells though, doesn't it?" She pulled her face. "The poo tends to stick to the wall of the shaft, and the drains get blocked quite often, so it piles up at the bottom and they have to get men in to dig it out." "What, with spades?" Joe was horrified. That had to be the worst job in the world. "I suppose so," Lucy said. "I've never seen them. They do it at night. I think they take it away in carts. They're called gong farmers. I've seen them bricking up the drain wall again the next day." "They have to knock walls down to get at the stuff, but that's crazy." "How else would they do it?" Joe couldn't answer. Clearly there was no mains water here like in his own world, and yet the Romans had managed to have running water. "Do you want to go and have a look?" Lucy asked mischievously. "You could change your clothes while you're about it." "What? Why?" She laughed. "You don't need to, but there'll probably be quite a lot of clothes hung up in there." "That's disgusting." "The moss thinks so too." She grinned. "It keeps them away." "Well, I don't need to see, thanks," Joe said firmly. He looked around the room. There were a few lumpy mattresses lined up along one wall, but there were no beds or drapes. The stone floor was covered with a kind of woven mat, and there were 2 chests, roughly finished, not like the polished chests upstairs. There was nothing else. "Who sleeps in here?" he asked. "Servants," Lucy said. "I'm not sure how many. 8, maybe. All of the downstairs chambers on this side of the castle are for servants." Joe looked again at the mattresses. They didn't look enough for more than 4 men at most. "Does Morley sleep in here?" he asked. It seemed far too dirty and dingy for someone as important as the steward. "Oh, no," Lucy laughed again. "Morley and the yeoman servants all have their own chambers." "Yeoman servants?" "The chief cook, the usher of the hall, the yeoman of the buttery, the yeoman of the cellar." Seeing Joe's incomprehension, she said patiently, "The yeoman of the buttery looks after the beer, and the yeoman of the cellar looks after the wine and the plate." "One plate? For the whole castle? How does that work?" "No," she giggled. "Plate means all the silverware and pewter, the dishes and goblets, like those boys were supposed to be polishing." "Oh, I see." Joe looked away. He felt foolish. "Anyway, I'd say this room is probably for the lower ranking servants, the men who work in the cellar and buttery. And maybe the kitchen boys, though I think the scullions sleep on the kitchen hearth. They have to keep the fires burning all night. To be honest, I'm not really sure. The only ones I know about for certain are the ladies and gentlemen in waiting. They sleep on the floors of our chambers. She crossed the room to a door on the other side. Jo followed, pondering over the things Lucy didn't know. It had been like this at Fishbourne. She'd had no idea how many slaves her family had there. Mary will be up at the top, she said, leading the way up another spiral staircase. By the time they had climbed the 3 flights, Jo felt slightly dizzy. As he followed her into the room at the top of the stairs, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A woman in a plain dark dress was bending over a table, apparently spitting on the fur collar of the cloak spread out in front of her. "Hello, Mary," Lucy said. The woman looked up. "Mistress Lucy," she said with a curtsy. She didn't look remotely guilty or embarrassed. On the table beside the cloak was a pottery jug and a cup, and a bowl from which she now took a handful of white powder. "My mother would like you to fetch some dried fruit and ripe cheese for Anne," Lucy said. "Very good, mistress." Mary sprinkled the powder over the fur, then wiped her hands on a cloth and turned to go. "What was that you were doing, by the way?" Lucy asked. The lady-in-waiting turned in the doorway. "The fur had gone hard," she said. "You soften it by spurting wine from your mouth and then sprinkling flour over it. I'll give it a good brush later. Then we'll hang the cloak outside to get rid of any moths or fleas that got into the press." She curtsied again and hurried away down the stairs. "Why did you ask her about that?" Jo asked. "You didn't really want to know, did you?" Lucy smiled. "I knew you would ask me, and I wouldn't have known the answer. Now then." She perched herself on the wooden window seat. "You wanted to talk somewhere away from everyone. Here we are." Jo looked around for somewhere to sit so that he didn't have to stand in front of Lucy, like a servant awaiting his master's judgment. The room was small and an odd, almost triangular shape. One of the walls was taken up with a vast cupboard, the press Mary had mentioned, he supposed. The table with the cloak spread out on it filled most of the remaining space, but there was a small chest across from the window seat. He sat on that and took a deep breath. "I've already told you that I come from the future," he began. "But that's not all. I've also met you before, in the past, at Fishbourne Roman Palace, and then in Jorvik in the Viking Age. You were there in both worlds." "But that's impossible," Lucy protested. "I hardly know anything about the Romans, and I've never heard of Fishbourne or the other thing you said. Anyway, I'd remember you if we'd met before." "I don't think you would, though," Jo said. "This happened in Jorvik. I knew you, but you didn't know me. I think it's because you're in a different life each time. Although when I told you my name this morning, you did say you felt as though you knew me," he added hopefully. "Did I? I don't know why." Jo ploughed on. "The rest of your family were there as well, both times. In fact, I could have guessed most of their names if I'd thought about it." He decided to keep it to himself that he'd actually guessed both of her parents' names wrong. "It's all very well for you to say that now," Lucy said. "I've told you all of them." "Except for your brother or sister who died," Jo said. "You haven't yet told me anything about that, have you?" "No." She sounded guarded. "It was your littlest brother, wasn't it? And he was only 4 years old." Jo paused for effect. Lucy's eyes were wide. "Was his name Freddie?" "No," Lucy said with satisfaction. Jo was nonplussed. "What was his name then?" "Francis," she said. "All right. He was Freddie before, which is why I thought he might be Freddie, but Francis isn't far off, is it? And I was right about his age and his place in the family, wasn't I?" Lucy nodded. She looked uneasy. "Anyway, the reason I'm telling you all this is that the other person who was there was Tobias, and both times he tried to hurt you badly." "But Tobias is kind," she cried. "He would never do that." "I can see why you'd think that," Joe admitted. "I don't know yet what he has against you in this world. Or me, come to that." Excuse me. Or me, come to that. Because he hated me too, both times. But just don't forget, he lied to you this morning." "What makes you say that?" "He told you he'd only left you because the Falconer wanted him back at the Mews straight away. But the man at the gatehouse said he wasn't here when we came through. He should have been back long before us if he was telling you the truth." "But," Lucy frowned, "there must be some explanation." Before Joe could answer, there was the distant sound of a bell ringing. Excuse me. Just going to have a quick glass of water. Sorry about that. Before Joe could answer, there was the distant sound of a bell ringing. Lucy got down from the window seat. "That'll be dinner. We have to go." Rather than setting off back down the stairs as Joe expected, she went through a second doorway beside the chest he'd been sitting on. It opened into first one room and then another, both looking out over the castle grounds towards the lake. "These are the guest chambers. Morley might put you up here to sleep if there isn't room with the other pages," she said. "I'm not sure I'll ever find my way out, if he does," Joe said. She smiled. "It's not that complicated. We're above my parents' chamber here." She led the way through a third room, and this one is above the chamber where I sleep. "So where does your uncle's family sleep?" "He and his wife have chambers on the first floor below my parents." "What about their children?" "They don't have any. My Aunt Jane has been with child 8 times, but 5 times the baby was born dead, and the other 3 died within a few weeks." "That's terrible," Joe exclaimed. Lucy nodded. "It's not all that unusual, though. Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, was with child 6 times, 3 of them sons, but only the Lady Mary survived. Of course," she added as an afterthought, "in her case it was a bit different." "Why?" "God was punishing her for marrying Henry when she'd been married to his brother before." "You don't really believe that, do you?" "Of course. The king said so, so it must be true. But even so, it still happens often enough. At least my aunt survived the births. Lots of women don't." They went in silence down the spiral staircase, past the door to Lucy's room, past the first-floor rooms, and out into the courtyard again. The earlier toing and froing had now ceased, and people were either going out through the main entrance or moving towards a staircase in the corner of the courtyard. Lucy and Joe joined the second group. "Where are the others going?" Joe asked. "Out to the boiling house. That's where they feed all the outdoor servants." "Do they get the same as us?" "Goodness, no. They'll be having pottage." "What's that?" "It's a kind of thick soup made mostly with vegetables, and perhaps a bit of stockfish," she added, wrinkling her nose. "Most of the indoor servants will be eating that too, only in the great hall." "But we get something else?" "Of course. It might still be Lent, but we have a proper meal all the same. It might include pottage, but it'll be nicer than theirs. Stockfish is horrible." They'd reached a dark corridor at the top of the stairs, with doors on the right to what Joe guessed must be more kitchens. On the left was a doorway into the great hall. It was rather like suddenly entering a very ornate church, Joe thought. The wooden screen they had just stepped through and the square panelling all the way round the room were painted with bright geometric patterns. Above, Tall windows with stained glass coats of arms stretched up to the painted ceiling high overhead. It was quite dim, in spite of the sun casting coloured shapes on the floor. A man with a stepladder and taper was making his way round the room, lighting the torches that were mounted on the walls above the panelling. Dark smudges on the plaster behind them showed where they smoked. Joe watched the servants taking their places at the long trestle table that had been set down the length of the hall. There were about 30 of them, only 6 of whom were women, including Mary. People didn't just sit at the next free space, he saw, but went to a particular place at the table. At first he thought they were sitting in order of age because the youngest boys were all at the ends nearest the door, whilst the older boys were in the middle. But among the adults at the far end there were older men between younger ones. Perhaps the hierarchy was according to rank then. Maybe the more important you were, the further away from the entrance you sat. When Joe looked at what everyone was wearing, that made more sense. The clothes of the boys at the near end of the hall were much plainer, rougher and lighter in colour than those worn by the men sitting at the top, the last 4 of whom were dressed all in black like Morley had been. Every one of them was wearing a hat. Obviously you had to keep your hat on, he thought to himself, even at meal times. Lucy led the way along the side of the hall and up onto a platform at the far end. Tomorrow there will be another trestle table or 2 for the outdoor servants so that everyone can eat together, she said. We'll be sitting up here on the dais, but today we'll be eating in the great chamber as usual. There'll only be about 10 of us anyway, with my father and Sir Thomas away, and my mother sitting with Anne. Only 10? Joe thought of their meals at home, where a full house was only 3 these days. Lucy counted on her fingers. There's Aunt Jane, her mother, my uncle's cousin and his friend who are staying for a few days, Morley, the 3 pages, me and you. I can eat with you? Joe asked, relieved. Today, yes, since the other pages will. If you're still here for the feast tomorrow, you'll be with the gentlemen servants. At the other end of the platform, there was a doorway into a room that was only slightly smaller than the hall. It had the same tall windows stretching upwards above the painted panelling and a tapestry over the fireplace. The table set in the centre of the room seemed almost lost in such a large space. Could we have a place for the Lord St. John's page, Master Joseph Hopkins? Lucy said to a manservant standing beside the doorway. Of course, mistress. He clicked his fingers, and a boy appeared. Fetch a place setting for Mistress Lucy's companion, commanded the man. The boy looked curiously at Joe. It was the same boy he'd noticed hurrying away from the staircase earlier on. Joe fidgeted, uncomfortable at feeling scrutinised, and then stopped himself. He had to learn to behave as though he had every right to be here. Then other people would accept him without question. Deliberately, he looked the other boy up and down. The boy was dressed much more simply than he was, in a jerkin and coarse brown hose. He was clearly of much lower rank than Joe. Joe put his shoulders back and stuck out his chest. Then he noticed that the boy wasn't looking at his face. He was staring at his neck, and there was something more than curiosity in his expression. Joe put his hand to his throat. His St. Christopher had escaped from beneath his collar and was hanging over the front of it. The moment his fingers touched the pendant, the boy's gaze snapped away. He turned and hurried out of the room to fetch the things he'd been asked for. Joe tucked the St. Christopher back inside the neck of his undershirt. Come and sit down, Lucy said. Joe moved across to the table, aware that his pulse was racing. He was just about to ask Lucy about the boy when a woman entered the room. Lucy stood up again. My Lady Jane, she said with a curtsy. May I present to you my friend, Master Joseph Hopkins. So Joe gets his first meal in this world, and it's quite a meal. Quite a contrast to Viking times. And of course we've had the loo again. I think I said when I was talking about the leopard in the golden cage, it's always there somewhere, whether Joe actually goes to the loo or not. He always has to see what they're like, because they've changed. It's already changed vastly, hasn't it? From the Roman thing with the benches with the holes and the sponges on sticks and the trenches underneath and the running water or the buckets of water for the sponges, depending on how swish it was. And then of course we had the sort of wattle kind of screens in the backyard with the moss to wipe your bum and just basically a hole in the ground. That was the Vikings. And now we've got the Jakes, where they've got these sort of long drop loos, a bit like a composting toilet. And they drop, it all drops down to a bricked in area at the bottom, but of course there's no ventilation, or not adequate ventilation, and like Lucy says, the poo gets stuck on the shaft. Delicious. So it's a pretty smelly business. So yeah, we always have that, we always have the food, and this meal is going to be quite peculiar because it's Lent still. It's Easter Saturday, so it's still Lent, so no meat. But my goodness me, you'll be amazed of the things they can think of to do with fish. And the number of fish that there are, fish that you've never heard of. So, I hope you come back tomorrow to find out how to make the best of not being allowed to eat meat in Lent. Alright? Lovely. That's it for today then. Have a good evening. Bye.